History is full of moments that seem too extraordinary to be true. The kind of stories that, if they weren't preserved in letters, official records, and the accounts of those who lived through them, would sound more like myths instead of history. An army crossing the Alps with elephants, a city buried beneath volcanic ash, a fleet destroyed by a typhoon, and then there's the winter of 1658. Imagine standing in complete darkness, not on solid ground, but in the middle of the sea. The temperature has fallen so far below zero that every breath becomes a cloud of tiny ice crystals before it disappears into the night. The wind simply doesn't blow, it cuts through wool, leather, and fur until it feels like it's found your bones. Beneath your boots is nothing but ice. And beneath that ice, black water, deep enough to swallow an army. Now imagine you aren't alone. Behind you stretches a line of thousands of soldiers, disappearing into the darkness. Horses stomp their hooves against the frozen surface, their breath rising like steam into the bitter air. Cannons, each weighing well over a ton, are strapped to wooden sleds. Supply wagons creak across the frozen sea carrying food, ammunition, and everything an army needs to survive. Every step adds more weight. Every sound makes you wonder, was that just the wind, or was the ice beginning to crack? Somewhere ahead, barely visible into the darkness, walks your king, Karl X Gustav. He isn't watching safely from a palace. He isn't waiting behind the lines. He's standing on the very same ice, facing the same wind, gambling his own life alongside yours. Because if the ice holds, Denmark will be forced to surrender. Sweden will become the dominant power in Scandinavia, and the map of Northern Europe will change forever. But if the ice breaks, there will be no battlefield, no glorious last stand, no heroic charge, only freezing water, darkness, and silence. It sounds impossible, the kind of story that history invents to make great kings seem larger than life. But this wasn't a legend. It wasn't propaganda. It happened. In the winter of 1658, an entire Swedish army marched across the frozen sea to invade Denmark, and what remains one of the boldest military gambles ever attempted. And against every expectation, the ice held. Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. Last episode, we met one of Sweden's most fascinating monarchs, Queen Christina, a woman who inherited one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms and did just something almost unimaginable. She walked away from it. She traded a crown for a life of intellectual freedom, leaving Sweden in the hands of her cousin Karl X Gustav. If Christina believed ideas could shape history, Karl Gustav believed history was shaped by men willing to fight for them. The two couldn't have been more different. Christina filled her court with philosophers, artists, and scholars. She invited Rene Descartes to Stockholm and dreamed of making Sweden the intellectual heart of Northern Europe. Carl Gustav had spent much of his life in the saddle. He was a soldier before he was a king, a commander shaped by years of campaigning across Europe during one of history's bloodiest conflicts. Where Christina saw diplomacy, Carl Gustav saw opportunity. Where she sought stability, he prepared for war. And in fairness, he had a good reason to. The empire he inherited looked enormous on the map, stretching much around the Baltic Sea. But empires don't become secure just because they're large. Sometimes the larger they become, the harder they are to defend. Sweden was surrounded by rivals who had watched its rise with growing resentment. Remember, empires don't simply make friends. The larger they become, the more enemies they create. Poland, Russia, Brandenburg, and above all, Denmark, an old enemy separated not by mountains, but by water. Within just a few years of taking the throne, Carl Gustav would face a decision so audacious, so reckless, that even his own officers struggled to believe it could work. He would attempt to do something no European king had ever done before: march an entire army across the sea. Today, we're telling the story of one of the boldest military gambles in history, a moment when winter itself became a weapon, when the sea became a road, and when the fate of Scandinavia rested on nothing more than the strength of the ice beneath thousands of marching feet. To understand why an entire army would one day march across the frozen sea, you first have to understand the man who gave the order. Karl X Gustav wasn't raised to become king. In fact, for much of his early life, the crown seemed destined to remain with his cousin, Queen Christina. Like many younger members of Europe's royal families, his future was expected to be found not on the throne, but on the battlefield. And in 17th century Europe, that was hardly an unusual place to build a career. This was an age when war wasn't the exception, it was almost the rule. Most of Europe had spent decades engulfed in conflict. Kingdoms rose and fell with astonishing speed. Armies marched across borders that seemed to change every generation. Entire towns disappeared beneath famine, disease, and violence. For men of Carl Gustav's generation, war wasn't an interruption to life, it was life. It's difficult for us to imagine today. Most of us have lived our entire lives without seeing armies march through our towns, without wondering whether the next harvest would be destroyed by soldiers, without asking whether our children would survive another campaign season. For 17th century Europeans, those weren't extraordinary fears, they were ordinary life. Long before Karl wore a crown, he wore armor. He learned command not from books, but from campaigns. He rode through Germany during the final years of the 30 Years' War, serving under Sweden's most experienced commanders. He watched how victories were won, how armies moved, and how quickly hesitation could become disaster. By the time Queen Christina abdicated in 1654, Carl Gustav was 32 years old. He wasn't an untested prince suddenly handed a kingdom. He was an experienced soldier inheriting an empire. But it wasn't an easy inheritance. On a map, Sweden looked enormous. Its territory stretched around much of the Baltic Sea, reaching into modern day Finland, Estonia, Latvia, northern Germany, and beyond. To Sweden's rivals, it looked unstoppable. To its new king, it looked exposed. Because every new province created another border to defend, another coastline to patrol, another enemy waiting for an opportunity. And there were plenty of enemies. Russia watched from the east. Poland, Lithuania had never accepted Sweden's growing influence. The Holy Roman Empire remained unpredictable, and to the south stood Denmark. If you listen to this podcast for any length of time, you'll know that Denmark and Sweden had been rivals for centuries. They fought over trade, territory, influence, and control of the Baltic. Victory rarely settled anything for long. Each war simply planted the seeds of the next. Then, in 1657, Denmark believed its moment had finally arrived. Carl Gustaf was deep inside Poland, leading Sweden's armies hundreds of kilometers from home. His soldiers had been campaigning for years. Supply lines were stretched, resources were thin. If you were King Frederick III of Denmark, what would you have done? Imagine looking across the Baltic and seeing your greatest rival distracted, exhausted, and far away. History has taught us that opportunities like that don't last forever. Frederick decided he couldn't afford to wait. He declared war. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable decision. It turned out to be one of the greatest miscalculations in Danish history. Carl Gustaf reacted with astonishing speed. Rather than becoming trapped in Poland as Frederick expected, he turned his army west. Within months, Swedish forces stormed across Jutland, driving the Danes backward again and again. Town after town fell. Before long, most of mainland Denmark was in Swedish hands. But then the advance stopped. Not because Denmark's army had finally held, not because Karl Gustav had run out of soldiers. The thing standing between Sweden and total victory was the sea. And that's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. If the story ended here, Karl X Gustav probably would have been remembered as a successful king. His army had crossed back into Scandinavia with astonishing speed. Danish forces had been driven out of Jutland. Frederick III's gamble had failed spectacularly, but then the campaign reached an obstacle no army could conquer: the sea. For centuries, the Danish islands had been the kingdom's greatest defense. An invading army could march across Jutland, but eventually it had to stop. The waters of the Little Belt and the Great Belt separated the mainland from Funen and Funen from Zealand, where Copenhagen stood. As long as Denmark controlled those waters, its capital remained safe. The Swedish army had reached the edge of the sea, and there it stalled. For most commanders, that would have been the end of the campaign. You wait for spring, build ships, negotiate, or simply accept you've gone as far as you can. But Karl Gustav wasn't facing most winters. He was living through one of the coldest periods Europe had experienced in centuries. Today, historians call it part of the Little Ice Age. It wasn't a single winter. It was a centuries-long period of unusually cold temperatures that reshaped life across Europe. Rivers that rarely froze solid. Harvests failed. Harbors closed beneath thick sheets of ice. Communities found themselves isolated for weeks, sometimes months. People didn't simply complain about the cold, many died because of it. That winter, 1657 into 1658, was especially brutal. Week after week, temperatures stayed below freezing. Before we go any further, we need to talk about the Baltic Sea, because not every sea can become a road. The Baltic is unusual. It's relatively shallow. It's less salty than the Atlantic. And especially cold winters, parts of it can freeze. Even today, it still happens, but usually not like this. Not across the vast stretches Carl Gustav hoped to cross. The Baltic began to change. At first, the edges froze, then sheltered harbors, then stretches of open water, until something almost unimaginable happened. The sea itself began to harden. Now, it's important not to imagine one smooth sheet of perfect ice. This wasn't like skating rink ice. The Baltic was alive. The ice groaned, it shifted, pressure ridges rose where sheets collided, cracks opened without warning. Snow concealed weak spots. Some places were thick enough to support entire wagons. Others could barely hold a single man. No map could tell you which was which. If I could take you back to that winter, I don't think the first thing you notice would be the cold. I think you'd notice the silence. No crashing waves, no gulls circling overhead, just wind and the occasional deep, haunting sound of the sea moving beneath your feet. Imagine hearing that for the first time, a low rumble beneath the ice, almost like distant thunder, except the thunder is underneath you, somewhere out there. Carl Gustav received extraordinary news. Local fishermen, men who had spent their lives reading these waters, believed the little belt had frozen enough to cross. Think about that for a moment. Someone enters the king's tent. My king, the sea has frozen. Even hearing those words, you almost want to laugh. Frozen enough for an army? It sounded impossible. But impossible things have a way of changing history. Carl Gustav didn't dismiss the report. He ordered his engineers and experienced local guides onto the ice. Their job wasn't simply to ask, is it frozen? Their job was to answer a far more terrifying question. Can it hold an empire? The engineers returned with their report. The ice would probably hold. Probably. That's hardly the kind of certainty you'd want before sending an entire kingdom's army onto the open sea. But history is rarely shaped by perfect certainty. More often, it's shaped by people willing to act despite uncertainty. Karl X Gustav made his decision. They would march. It's difficult for us to appreciate just how extraordinary that order must have sounded. Imagine being one of his officers. You've spent your life studying war. You've learned how to cross rivers, lay sieges to cities, defend fortresses, fight cavalry, command infantry. No military manual prepares you for this. No commander teaches you how to invade a country by walking across the sea, yet that was now the plan. The first crossing over Little Belt proved that the impossible might actually be possible. The Swedish army moved carefully across the frozen water toward the island of Funen. The Danes were completely unprepared. They had trusted the sea for centuries. They had been right to. Now, their greatest defense had become Sweden's highway, but the Little Belt was only the beginning. Ahead lay the Great Belt, wider, deeper, far more dangerous. This was no frozen lake. This was open sea, and no army in European history had ever attempted to cross it. Before taking another step, Karl Gustav ordered more surveys. Experienced fishermen, engineers, local guides, men who understood ice better than generals ever could. They measured, probed, listened, and watched. Even then, there were no guarantees, only judgment, only experience, only hope. Then came the order. The march would begin before dawn. The coldest hours of the night offered the strongest ice. Darkness wasn't the enemy, warmth was. So, sometime before sunrise, thousands of soldiers stepped onto the Great Belt. If I could place you among them, I don't think your first emotion would be courage. I think it would be disbelief. Every instinct you ever had tells you not to walk on ice. Yet here you are, following the man ahead of you, one careful step, then another. The army stretched for kilometers. Infantry, cavalry, supply wagons, cannons weighing over a ton, thousands of horses, thousands of men, each footstep sending tiny vibrations through the frozen surface beneath them. And then the sounds, not battle, not gunfire, the ice. It creaked, it groaned, sometimes it cracked with a sound like distant cannon fire. Imagine hearing that beneath your boots. Imagine not knowing whether it was simply the ice settling or the first warning that it was about to give way. There were no guarantees, only the next step, and then the next. History often compresses impossible moments into a single sentence. The Swedish army crossed the Great Belt. 8 words, that's all. 8 words that hide hours of fear, of frozen fingers, of exhausted horses, of officers constantly watching the ice beneath them. 8 words that hide thousands of people wondering whether each would step their last step. Then, somewhere in the darkness, someone disappears. Maybe it's a horse, maybe it's a wagon, maybe it's a soldier. One moment they're there, and the next they're gone. Into the black water so cold that survival is measured in minutes. There are no dramatic rescues, no speeches, no heroic music. The column keeps moving because if everyone rushes toward the opening, the ice might fail beneath them all. Sources describe horses breaking through weak sections, equipment disappearing beneath the ice. Some soldiers were lost to freezing water. The exact number remains uncertain. What isn't uncertain is that once someone disappeared into that black water, there was very little anyone could do. You couldn't stop. You couldn't gather around the opening. That only risked collapsing more ice, so the march continued. Imagine watching someone vanish beside you and being ordered to keep walking, not because you didn't care, because stopping might kill everyone else. Even Karl X Gustav accepted the same risk. He didn't remain safely behind. He marched with his army. Every crack they heard, he heard. Every gust of wind, he felt. Every uncertain step, he took alongside them, whether out of courage, confidence, or an understanding that no soldier should be asked to face a danger their king refused to face. History can't tell us. Perhaps it was all three. When the Swedish army finally reached Zealand, the impossible had happened. They hadn't crossed a bridge, they hadn't built ships, they had simply walked across the sea, and Denmark could scarcely believe what it was seeing. When news reached Copenhagen, disbelief quickly turned into panic. For generations, the Danish islands had been protected by the sea. Every military calculation, every defensive plan, every assumption about Denmark's security rested on one simple fact. No army could simply walk across the water until one did. Imagine being King Frederick III. Only months earlier, you had declared war, believing Sweden was too distracted to respond. Instead, your enemy had crossed half of Europe, driven your armies from Jutland, and now stood on the island protecting your capital. Not because they possessed some revolutionary new weapon, not because they had built an enormous fleet, because winter had transformed the sea itself into a road. Copenhagen was exposed. The Swedish army stood only a short distance away. Frederick faced a terrible choice: fight and risk losing everything, or negotiate and surrender lands that had belonged to Denmark for centuries. He chose peace. On February 26, 1658, representatives of Sweden and Denmark met in the city of Roskilde. The treaty they signed would redraw the map of Scandinavia. For Sweden, it was the greatest diplomatic victory in its history. For Denmark, it was a national catastrophe. Denmark surrendered Skåne, one of the richest agricultural regions in Scandinavia. Blekinge, with its long coastline along the Baltic. Bohuslän, opening Sweden to the North Sea. Halland, now permanently Swedish. These weren't empty places, they were homes. And the Norwegian province of Trøndelag. Think about what that meant for ordinary people. History often tells us that kingdoms exchange territory, but kingdoms aren't empty. They're filled with families, farmers, merchants, children, priests, people who wake up expecting life to continue as it always has. Imagine going to bed one night as the subject of the Danish king and waking up under the Swedish crown. The people of Skåne have spoken Danish for generations. Their laws reflected Danish traditions. Their churches answered to Copenhagen. Overnight, they found themselves citizens of a different kingdom. That transition would take decades, in some places, generations. Not everyone accepted Swedish rule. Some resisted, some fled, others simply adapted because life had to go on. When we look at the modern map of Sweden today, it's easy to assume those borders have always existed. They haven't. Much of southern Sweden became Swedish because one winter, the sea froze, and one king decided to trust the ice. It's tempting to think of the march across the ice as little more than an incredible military story: an army, a frozen sea, an impossible gamble, the kind of tale that sounds almost too dramatic to be true. But if that's all it was, we probably wouldn't still be talking about it more than 3.5 centuries later. Because the real story isn't just the march, it's what the march changed. Today, if you travel through southern Sweden, if you visit Malmö or wander the streets of Lund, or explore the fishing villages of Skåne, it's easy to forget that these places weren't always Swedish. For hundreds of years, they were part of Denmark. The people who lived there spoke Danish, prayed for the Danish king, traded with Copenhagen. They never imagined that a single winter could change the country they belonged to. Yet that's exactly what happened. The border that millions of people cross today without a second thought was shaped by one extraordinary decision made during one extraordinary cold winter. Today, trains glide across the bridge in less than an hour. Families travel between Malmö and Copenhagen for work, for concerts, for dinner. Without even thinking about passports or armies, the water below feels peaceful, ordinary, almost timeless. It's difficult to imagine that these same waters once decided the fate of kingdoms, but history has a way of hiding itself in plain sight. Sometimes it's beneath the cobblestones of an old city, sometimes it's inside the walls of a medieval castle. And sometimes it's beneath the surface of the sea. The march across the ice also reminds us of something deeply human. History celebrates bold decisions, but it rarely reminds us how terrifying those decisions are while they're being made. Karl X Gustav didn't know the ice would hold. His officers didn't know. His soldiers certainly didn't know. Every step they took required trust. Trust in the engineers who measured the ice, trust in the officers leading the columns, trust in one another, and perhaps most of all, trust that the man asking them to risk everything had judged correctly. If the ice had failed, we probably wouldn't remember Karl X Gustav as a military genius. We might remember him as one of Europe's greatest fools. History often gives success the name brilliance. Failure is remembered very differently. But on that winter night, the ice held, the Swedish army crossed, the map changed, a kingdom expanded, another was humbled. And all because one king asked a question no one else dared to ask. Could an army walk across the sea? In the end, it could. The ice held an empire. Today, people cross the waters between Sweden and Denmark every single day. Some take the train across the Öresund Bridge, others board a ferry. For most, it's an ordinary journey, but history has a remarkable way of hiding itself in familiar places. The next time you find yourself looking out across those waters, I hope you'll remember that they weren't always just water. For one extraordinary winter, they became a road, and they changed Scandinavia forever. Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. Tack så mycket för att ni lyssnat. Vi hörs nästa gång.